Hi, peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and the author of 4 baking books. Each Saturday, I'm hanging out with the sweetest bakers around and taking a deep dive into their signature bakes. This week, we're revisiting our episode with Melissa Weller, one of the top bakers in New York City. Known for her delicious sticky buns, bagels, and babka, Melissa originally worked as a chemical engineer before following her heart to culinary school. In this episode, we talk all about her time running the pastry kitchens at beloved New York restaurants, including Per Se and Roberta's. She also guides me through how to get her chocolate babka recipe just right. Stay tuned for our chat and keep an eye out for Melissa's new cookbook, Very Good Bread, hitting shelves this November. If you'd like to follow along, you can find today's recipe at cherrybomb.com. Today's episode is presented by King Arthur Baking Company. Whether you're a serious baker or just a newbie, King Arthur is here to help you be the best baker you can be. Their flours are some of the most coveted in the industry, as you've heard from many of my guests. With the holiday season fast approaching, might I suggest tapping into King Arthur's host of resources to help you level up your baking game. With ingredients and tools for every baking occasion, over 2,000 recipes, and virtual and on-demand classes, King Arthur will guide you every step of the way. Did you know they also have a baker's hotline where you can speak to a professional baker 7 days a week? I mean, peeps, how cool is that? No matter your question or concern, King Arthur is here to help this holiday season and beyond. Head to kingarthurbaking.com to learn more and call 1-855-371-BAKE. That's 1-855-371-BAKE to try the hotline for yourself. I have big news for you. My new cookbook, Salty, Cheesy, Herby, Crispy, Snackable Bakes, is now available. This is my first savory baking book, and I'm so excited to share it with all of you. It features 100 easy-peasy baking recipes for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and of course, snacking. From sage butter scones to smash burger hand pies and tomato za'atar galette. You'll also find 6 of my essential savory baking hacks, including how to make my magic melted butter pie dough and the quickest and easiest caramelized onions. My cookbook tour is underway, and tickets are on sale right now at cherrybomb.com. Thanks to everyone who joined me in New York. I'll be in San Francisco on Tuesday, October 8th, Chicago on Tuesday, October 15th, and Boston on Wednesday, October 23rd. I can't wait to see you. Thank you to Kerrygold and King Arthur Flour for supporting my tour. You can click the link in the show notes of this episode to order the book, or pick up a copy at your favorite local bookstore. I hope you love salty, cheesy, herby, crispy, snackable bakes as much as I loved writing it. Let's check in with today's guest. Melissa, so excited to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to talk chocolate babka with you and so much more.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be here.
Yay! You are frequently described as a master baker and are known for your incredible old-world baked goods like babka and bagels and sticky buns and more. And I think it's fair to say that your mastery is born in part from the circuitous route you took to baking. And so first, I was hoping you could explain what it means to be a master baker, and then tell us a little bit about the journey you took to being one, which notably includes both chemical engineering and an easy bake oven.
I guess I should say I don't consider myself a master baker. I think that's because I'm such a perfectionist. And also, I think that there's a formal test that you take to become a master baker, which I have not done. Just like if you're an engineer, there's a test to become like a certified engineer. So I never really think, oh, I'm a master baker, but I do think that because of my background, I am very precise and exacting about how I approach my baking. My background is I studied engineering, chemical engineering in college, and I think that sort of relates to my personality, or maybe my personality was shaped and my baking was shaped by studying engineering, where you start out and you're always doing some kind of lab work, lab testing. And so when you're testing something, it's sort of like testing something when you're trying to figure out a baking recipe. You start out with, okay, I think this is the formula that I'm going to use to make the babka. I'm going to see how it works. I'm going to go through all of the steps, and then and maybe we all do this as bakers, go back and say, hey, oh, that didn't work and why not? Or it's too doughy in the center. Did I bake it to the right temperature? And I think because of that, that sort of has shaped my path towards wanting to perfect things and get them right according to my palate and sort of my vision of what I want to make.
I know the baking came later in life, post-chemical engineering, but tell us about the Easy Bake Oven and your mom and baking cookies.
My mom was a elementary school teacher, super duper creative, was always doing crafts, sewing, gardening, cooking and baking at home. And so she always had me get involved in everything. I learned how to sew in elementary school. I really gravitated towards the baking part of it. And so she set me up with an Easy Bake Oven. And do they exist today? I don't know.
I don't even know.
But all I remember were you took the cookie dough. It was always sugar cookie dough, cut out thin, and you put it on this little tray and you pushed it through the oven. And I think it had a light bulb that heated up, and then it came out the other side. It had to have baked it all the way through, but I don't think I cared as a kid how it came out. I was just happy to bake, eat the cookies after I baked them. What's more rewarding than that?
I love that. And I was hoping you could describe your dessert style.
Yes. Finished culinary school in 2004 at the French Culinary Institute, and I immediately started working at Babbo. I liked the dessert menu that Gina De Palma had created at Babbo, and it had some savory components. And back in 2004, it was hard to find savory components, even like olive oil in desserts. Herbs like thyme and rosemary, that was all savory at that point. And so I gravitated towards her menu. I liked what she did. It was unfussy. It was very simple components put together in a very elegant way. And it was about the taste. It was less about the presentation. The presentation was rustic. It wasn't this precise, plated dessert. But I mostly liked the flavor combinations that she created. Then I went on to primarily focus on baking bread and doing things with yeast. And so Sullivan Street Bakery was essentially learning how to bake bread, learning all of the steps in a professional bakery, how to go from A to B. And then at Per Se, I was the head baker. That was a very intense time for me to focus on learning a lot of new recipes, again, all with yeast and flavor components. And the breads had to be specific for a specific dish, like the cheese bread had to complement the cheeses. It couldn't have an ingredient that overshadowed the cheeses or that was anywhere else on the menu. And I think after those 3 experiences, and I believed in working for a while before I tried my own thing. So I got to try my own thing at Roberta's. And that was the first time where I could do whatever I wanted to do. And I had all of these ideas and visions of what I wanted to do.
So you're known for creating these highly sought-after artisan breads and bagels, and you've said that it was maybe your love of hard sourdough pretzels from childhood that may have at least led to the bagel making. But how about the babka and the sticky buns and the other old-world baked goods? What led you to them? I've read that it might be an obsession with breakfast pastries.
Oh, that's great. And that's an excellent question. When I left Roberta's, I was ready to open my own bakery. The Williamsburg Smorgasburg outdoor market was happening, and I thought, I'll just do this until I open my own bakery. And a friend told me, oh, well, you have to have something that's signature there. You can't just get in selling all sorts of things. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to sell bagels. I love to make bagels, but I felt that I didn't really know enough. There's a big part of history that is around bagels, and I didn't know as much as I wanted to. And so I was sort of thinking when I had that stand, what else can I make that would go with the bagels? And now I started curing my own lox, making bagel sandwiches and schmears. But then when I left, I did the Smorgasburg for the summer of, I think it was 2013. And
Can you tell people, just in case they don't know, what the Smorgasburg is?
Yes. It's an outdoor market in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, my neighborhood in Brooklyn. It's sort of like a food bonanza of different entrepreneurial spirits trying to get started in the food industry. And it's a great way for them to first get started and get their name out there. And so I thought that was a good idea for me at the time with the bagels. And I think it was a good idea because I met my partners through the Williamsburg Smorgasburg. Together we formed a partnership and we started working on it literally 10 years ago in the fall of 2013. And we started to talk about what goes with bagels. We're going to open up this bagel bakery, restaurant, what will go with the bagels? And I'd done enough research at that point to think, okay, well, babka goes with bagels because it's old world, it's Jewish, and you could say Jewish inspired too. And I'm like, well, what else goes with bagels? And I just kept going down the list of all of the things in my head that I'd been reading about and dreaming of and visiting. I think I went to Russ and Daughters to see what they had at the time. And I brought home their cinnamon babka. And I was like, how did they make this? This is very interesting. I want to sort of figure out how they made it. And that's sort of where it got started.
We'll be right back. This episode is presented by Kerrygold, makers of the most beloved butter around. I've hosted more than 75 episodes of this podcast, so I've become an expert on what the best bakers in this country love when it comes to ingredients, and it's fair to say that Kerrygold butter is at the top of their lists. And mine too. After all this time as a professional baker and recipe developer, I've gotten pretty picky about the ingredients I keep in my pantry and my fridge. So it should come as no surprise that Kerrygold is a must for lots of my bakes. I use it when making the cheddar Old Bay butter swim biscuits from my new book. Yes, the biscuit dough literally swims in a pool of butter as it bakes. And in my, dare I say, genius melted butter pie dough, I also use it in my epic snickerdoodles and in the marshmallow frosting for my devil's food cake. I think I might need to get in the kitchen after this recording session. Why is Kerrygold butter so special? It's made with milk from Irish grass-fed cows and has a rich flavor and creamy texture thanks to its naturally higher butterfat percentage. This also gives Kerrygold butter that beautiful natural golden yellow color we all know and love. If you haven't baked with Kerrygold butter yet, now is the perfect time to try and taste the difference for yourself. Head to KerrygoldUSA.com to learn more. And DM me your bakes. I'd love to see what you're up to. Peeps, have you heard the news? Cherry Bomb's first ever Jubilee Wine Country is happening in Napa Valley on October 26th and 27th. It'll be a weekend filled with great wine, winemakers, beautiful food, seasonal produce, conversation, connection, and California. Passes are now available. To learn more and snag a pass, visit cherrybomb.com. Let's talk a little bit about Chocolate Babka background. Just in case people don't know, can you tell us what a babka is?
A babka is a sweet yeasted cake, essentially. It's related to, and this may be a far-out cake too, a Kugelhopf. It's all a family that comes from Europe, most likely Eastern Europe, of sweet yeasted doughs, usually filled with something. And it was one of those yeasted sweet breads that would be made at home.
We should mention that this incredible Chocolate Babka is also the cover of A Good Bake. And it's this incredible picture with this Johnny Miller, right? Was your photographer?
Yes.
Incredible. With this thick chocolate glaze dripping off of it. Is that traditional to have a glazed babka?
That's a good question, too. I think up until that point, there was no glaze on babka. It was like cookie crumbs. It was like a crumble, like a streusel.
Yes.
It was like a thick streusel. And I remember with my partners for Sedell's, we tried streusel, but the streusel would sort of crumble. And we decided that, is there another more elegant way, we said to ourselves? And I think we came up with the idea of doing a glaze on the babka instead of streusel. And I remember, this goes back before I even started my culinary career, babka in the city, I just remember out on Long Island, it was streusel on the top.
Yeah.
And so the magic for the cover of the cookbook, it was Johnny Miller's idea. He's like, just glaze it and I'll take a bunch of shots as you're glazing it. And the glaze is going to fall down the sides. And so that was fun.
Now we're going to talk about the recipe, do a deep dive. So first things first, we're going to make the dough. So we're going to whisk some all-purpose flour and some sugar and some instant yeast. And I had a couple of questions. First of all, is there a style of whisk that you like?
I like one that's not too much of a piano whisk. Do you know, like where the metal tongs or tines are so tight together that things get stuck in the middle? Like a balloon whisk or just like an all-purpose whisk is usually fine.
Mm-hmm. Is there a brand of all-purpose flour that you always turn to?
I always go to King Arthur all-purpose flour. I do.
So we're whisking some all-purpose flour, a little bit of sugar, and we have some instant yeast. And I have two questions. First of all, why instant versus active? And then also, are you always like an instant person?
I'm always an instant person, unless it's not available.
Mm-hmm.
At Per Se, We only used fresh yeast. At Sullivan Street Bakery, we used instant yeast. When I left Per Se, it was like, well, what? And I was doing sourdough, so then that wasn't yeast. What choice? And so at Roberta's, it was more efficient to use instant yeast. You could buy a case. You could keep it in your walk-in until you needed it. And then we would make some things like the sticky bun logs, and we'd freeze them, and we'd pull them out as we needed. And what we learned was that over time, the instant yeast will not hold up in the freezer. The sticky bun log wouldn't last for us more than 6 days with just regular instant yeast. And so I had taken a baking class through, it was the Bread Bakers Guild. It was in Minnesota, and I had learned that the osmotolerant instant yeast, SAF Gold, is the brand that I like to go with. And SAF makes two different types of instant yeast. They make Gold, which is osmotolerant, and they make the red, regular. The osmotolerant yeast doesn't react with the sugar in the dough the way that the regular instant yeast does. It proofs better. You get a better, bigger proof because the regular instant yeast gets sort of hung up on all the sugar in the dough. So if you were just using regular instant yeast, which I have used interchangeably with active dry, but if you're using that, it affects the rate of the loaf proofing. Because I thought I could get away with it for a challah, or I was trying different yeasts at one point, and I'm like, it's not proofing the same way.
Can anyone? I've never even seen the Gold. Can anyone get the Gold?
You can't find it in a grocery store, as far as I've noticed. A lot of bakeries will have it. When it's just me baking at home, I generally order it online.
Is it the Gold that you ended up using to be able to freeze things?
Yeah, I always go with the Gold because it can be used interchangeably with the red. And then also, if you're an active dry yeast person where you have to bloom it, that's because the dead yeast coating, the active yeast, is pretty thick on the active dry. I usually use those and replace 1-to-1. I have these strange formulas in my head for replacing yeast. If it's fresh yeast, there's more water content in the yeast. So I think I pretty much have or multiply the amount of fresh yeast by 0.4, which is a little less than half to get the instant yeast amount. And then if I just have active dry yeast, I bloom it in the water and I use it 1-for-1 with the instant.
So we're whisking our flour, our sugar, our instant yeast, our fine sea salt.
I use the French baleine in the blue cylinder. I use the fine sea salt because that's generally the way bakeries order salt. They order them in the 50-pound bag. So kosher salt comes in the boxes. And so for a baker who's using a lot of salt in their large bakery, it's more efficient to just get a 50-pound bag of salt, which is usually refined sea salt.
So we're going to whisk all of these ingredients together in a large bowl. So then in a bowl of a stand mixer with a dough hook, and I assume it's a KitchenAid mixer you have at home?
That's what I have at home, yeah.
We're going to add whole milk. We're going to add an egg and an egg yolk. Is the yolk there for a little moisture, for extra fat?
Richness, extra fat.
Yeah. We're going to add the dry ingredients, and then we're going to mix on low speed for 3 minutes to create a homogeneous dough. Then we're going to increase the speed to medium, mix for 5 to 8 minutes until the dough completely wraps around the hook and cleans the side of the bowl. And I was struck by this because I feel like so frequently it doesn't exactly clean. It's still clinging. And is this dough, the way that you've created it, is it one that really that'll be on your hook when it's ready?
I think it does wrap around. I think because this is before you add the butter.
Yes.
Before you add the butter, it should wrap around. It should be dry enough that it wraps around the hook. But if it doesn't, don't worry, just keep moving on to the next step.
So with the mixer still running on medium, we're going to add some super soft unsalted butter. Tell us about that. You don't want just room temp, right? It has to
be really soft.
Yeah.
And I've had different assistants in the bakery, and the butter's not soft enough, and then it never really melts into the dough. And I'm like, oh. And so sometimes, and this isn't how the recipe is written, but this is what I've done in different bakeries. Sometimes I'll have them add the butter at the beginning, which is sort of counterintuitive because you're always like, don't you need to develop the gluten? But from there, it develops plenty so that you could add the soft butter with all of the other ingredients and mix it that way also.
That's kind of a nice tip.
It helps a lot whenever, if you're left, I can't tell you the number of times there have been chunks in the dough of the butter that doesn't quite go into the dough, and now the dough is too soft. It doesn't want to mix in. this way gets rid of that problem.
And that's a great tip. So we're going to add our super soft unsalted butter, mix until the butter is mixed in, no butter chunks, 5 to 10 minutes. And then we're going to stop to wipe down the dough hook and clean it once or twice with a wet hand, which I loved that tip.
Oh.
I've never done that. That's such a good idea. You just kind of soak your hand and then pull off the dough.
Yeah, I think it's a baker thing.
Yeah.
You know, anytime you don't want, because if you're working in a professional bakery, the number of times that dough is going to stick to your hands and you have to rinse it off, it gets to be too much. I had a dermatologist look at my hands once and she's like, oh my God, what are you doing? Because your hands just get dried and cracked. Yeah. So if you wet your hand with water, things don't stick to it. And that goes with like shaping dough too. It's like a great way to not get dough to stick to your hands. That.
So now we're going to ferment the dough, and you have a great explanation for why or I don't know if it's an explanation, but you label that first rest the fermentation and the second one the proofing. Can you explain that difference to people?
The yeast is doing the same thing during the 2 steps. During the fermentation step, it's fermenting the dough. The dough is in bulk. I guess it comes from my background. We've always called that the fermentation. And then once the dough is shaped, the yeast is still doing the same thing. It's just been redistributed in the shape, and it's still munching on the damaged starches and producing carbon dioxide and raising the finished product. And I've just always called that proofing.
So we remove the bowl from the mixer. We're going to wipe the dough hook clean with our wet hand. We're going to cover the bowl with a clean kitchen towel or plastic wrap and set it in a warm place to ferment for 2 hours. I thought this was interesting. We're going to turn the dough after about an hour by using a wet hand to fold the top edge down 2/3 of the way, then fold the bottom edge up to meet the top edge. That's sort of a traditional way to sort of make for a topped ball of dough. But I wondered 2 things. Do we flip it over after we make that shape in the bowl? And why do we do it at this 1 hour point?
1 hour point, it's good to do it like halfway through the fermentation. So it ferments for 2 hours. That's pretty standard. So it's nice to like redistribute the yeast halfway through. And I'll be honest, I can't remember if I called for flipping it upside down.
You don't. And I wondered if that was a choice, or I know sometimes.
It's a choice. It's a choice for this type of dough because I don't think it needs it. If it was 100% sourdough, I definitely would do that.
Okay, good to know.
Because it needs that extra help. But this has the commercial yeast in it, and it's already folding. You're already sort of helping the gluten out.
Yeah.
That it doesn't necessarily need to be flipped upside down.
Once it's fermented for those 2 hours, we're going to place the dough on a sprayed parchment-lined baking sheet.
I think it's like an aluminum sheet tray with the rim all around the side. It's pretty standard in any restaurant or bakery, and so that's what I have at home.
Yep.
And spraying the parchment is because the dough is really sticky, that it will stick to the parchment if you don't spray the parchment.
Okay. And we're going to use our hands to gently coax or pat the mound of dough into a square. Put the baking sheet in the refrigerator to chill for at least 2 hours. Could we leave it on the counter for these 2 hours, or you want it chilled?
It should be chilled.
Okay.
There's enough yeast in it. It doesn't need to be left out longer. It needs to be cold because the cold is what's going to help you roll it out.
Yep.
If you don't make it cold, it's going to be really challenging to roll out, and then you're going to end up using more flour. And then if you use more flour, it's going to make the end product dry.
Yep. Oh, and I thought this was a great tip. Even if you're not going to make it right away, wrap after it's chilled, because then the dough won't stick to the plastic wrap. I thought that was a great tip. And this time in the fridge for this additional 2 hours is still our fermenting period.
Yeah, it's still doing stuff.
Yep.
And gluten's still forming, which is why, if you're not flipping it upside down, over this long period of time, gluten is still doing something.
Yeah.
Fermentation is still happening.
Yeah. While the dough is fermenting, we're going to make the filling. I love this, all of this. I'm too excited. But anyway, we're going to process some homemade chocolate shortbread, which is actually a recipe in your book, into crumbs, or you can use store-bought chocolate cookies. But I wondered, I don't know if you've heard the news, but Nabisco is no longer making its chocolate cookies.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. Is there another cookie that you would recommend?
I think it's just about what you can find.
Okay.
Maybe the Archway Dutch chocolate soft sugar cookies.
Yep, something
Those
like
could
that.
Probably work.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. And I assume, it might change the flavor, but in a pinch, you probably could use a regular shortbread cookie, like a Walker's or something, or make your own. So we're going to process the chocolate shortbread into crumbs in a food processor, Cuisinart or a Robocoup, or
I think a Cuisinart is just fine.
Yep. And it's fitted with a metal blade. We got our crumbs, and then we're going to make a double boiler using a small saucepan. We're going to fit a bowl on top, make sure the water's not touching the bottom, basically bring the water to a gentle simmer. You're going to place milk chocolate, bittersweet chocolate, chopped if in bar form or chunks, and unsalted cube butter in the bowl of the double boiler and melt. Why 2 different types of chocolate?
When I work in a bakery, I try not to have too many different chocolates on hand at one time. It brings your ingredient costs up. Like if you have 10 different types of chocolate, that's probably not necessary. So usually I have a milk chocolate, a bittersweet chocolate, and I usually don't bake with semi-sweet chocolate. But I was thinking, well, if that's what you have at home, doesn't milk chocolate plus bittersweet chocolate equal semi-sweet chocolate? So it probably does. So if you wanted to substitute, I'm sure it would be fine and delicious.
That's good to know. With this butter, we're going to simmer until everything has melted, stirring occasionally with a heat-proof rubber spatula.
I like the ones with the more graduate, like it tapers to a finer point at the end where you can really get around the bowl. So as long as it's heat-proof, you're good.
So we're going to scrape down the chocolate on the sides of the bowl to make sure it melts evenly and doesn't burn. Turn off the heat. We'll remove the bowl from the double boiler, and we're wiping the bottom to make sure no water drips. Are we still worried about seizing our chocolate, or is it just keeping it clean in the kitchen?
I think it's just keeping it clean in the kitchen. If you take off the bowl and you're walking barefoot and then the hot water drips, you're like, ouch.
Yeah, smart. So now we're going to add our cookie crumbs and some mild flavored honey to our chocolate.
Buy 100% pure honey and look for the best price because it's pretty expensive these days.
And why honey? Since we already have something sweet from the chocolate, what does the honey do for our filling?
Honey is an inverted sugar. It will not crystallize and it will stay lucid, if you will. So it helps contribute to the filling not getting too set up and like a brownie.
So we'll stir to combine. We'll set our filling aside to cool. When we use it, we're going to want to make sure it's still warm and spreadable. So now we're going to take out our dough from the refrigerator and we're going to roll it. We're going to spray either a 9x4-inch Pullman. Just in case people don't know, can you describe what a Pullman pan is?
Pullman has straight sides. I think I'm enamored by it because of the straight sides. It doesn't have tapered outsides. They're like straight and even. You know me, precise and straight and even are all things that I love. And so I like to bake it in the Pullman loaf pan, but not everybody has one. I've definitely baked them in like a 9x5 loaf pan, like the same loaf pan you would bake a banana bread in. That works fine. I have Pullman loaf pans. I think I have USA brand Pullman loaf pans, one of the easiest ones you can buy online.
Yeah, I like their pans.
Yeah.
I'm the same way. Despite not being a chemical engineer, I love when I use a loaf pan. I hate it if it has slopey sides. I even like an 8.5 by 4.5 inch better.
Me too.
Because I just love the way the baked loaf looks.
Me too. And I like the taller. It gets taller that way. It doesn't spread out.
Me too. So we're going to remove our fermented dough and quickly, so it doesn't get too warm, roll it with a floured pin.
French rolling pin, not with tapered sides, with straight sides.
Yep.
That works best for me. Others would be comfortable with one of those ball-bearing rolling pins. That's fine, too. Whatever works best for you. I find I get more pressure when I use the French rolling pin.
Yeah. We're going to roll it into a 16-inch square on a floured work surface. But I did read this about you, and I feel like we're connected this way. What do you think about rolling out on a silicone, like, rolling mat? Like am I pronouncing it right? A rouled pot?
Yeah, I think that's what it's called.
Yeah, because I use those kinds of mats all the time to keep my kitchen clean and because you use less flour.
Yeah.
Can you tell people what that is? Because it's a great tool.
It's like a great tool. Just things don't stick to it. Not as much. You still need to use a little flour, but they don't stick like they would on your regular surface. And it's easy to clean up afterwards. I just sort of brush it and then roll it up.
Yeah, these mats are fabulous. Rotating your dough as you roll, you're rolling from the center outwards. And then at this point, are we refrigerating again for about 30 minutes before spreading the filling? Maybe only if the dough is a little too warm at this point?
For me, I can roll it out really fast.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't refrigerate it. But when I've taught somebody, it takes a while to get that precision to get it out to 16 by 16. So usually the length of time it takes to roll out is longer. And so the dough does get warmed up. Because once you put the filling on, you have to roll it and pick it up. And if it's already soft, it's going to be difficult to handle. So I would recommend refrigerating it.
Yeah. Now, either refrigerated or not, depending on our kitchen and how fast we worked, we're going to fill the babka. We're going to use an offset spatula.
Whatever you have.
Yep, use an offset spatula.
Big or small, like whatever you have at home, I found. I'm like, oh, I only see the little one. I'm going to use the little one today. Yep. That's okay.
I kind of love the little one better than the big one. I like the way it fits in my hand.
Me too.
So we're going to use an offset to spread 2/3 of the warm filling over the dough, taking care to spread to the edges, right? We're not really interested in a perimeter.
No.
Spreading a little bit at a time. Now we're going to shape the babka, so we'll gently roll the dough or the square away from us to form like a fat roll. And there's something fun about saying form fat roll. I don't know. I love the way it rolls off the tongue. And then we'll pick up our roll and we will kind of with 2 hands gently pull it apart to elongate it, set it down, and cut it in half. Do you use a chef's knife, a bench scraper?
Chef's knife. Bench scraper would work.
And you're cutting it, each piece, approximately 10 inches. Now, up to this point, that's very traditional with a babka, right?
Yeah.
And that's how we're getting our 2 strips, or the strips that we'll use to make our braid. So now we're going to spread. This is so interesting and a little confusing, so I hope I do it justice.
This is my obsessive compulsiveness coming out.
Oh, I think it's genius. But basically at this point, we're going to spread the remaining 1/3 of the filling across. Now, I wasn't sure if it was just the top or also the sides of 1/2 of the babka, and then place the second, I'm calling it the naked half, on top of the filling-covered one to form an X.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to twist the ends. So I'm picturing my X. We're now going to take the V and then the inverted V and twist those 2 ends together. I just wrote in my notes, is this some genius babka making technique? And you've written that adding that layer of filling between the rolled babka dough helps keep the layers separate.
Oh, that's right. That's the obsessive compulsiveness
when the babka bakes,
out.
resulting in the more layered babka. Yeah. Is that how you get your incredible interior?
Yeah, you don't have to. Now, I've seen an old school, like where they don't cut it in half and they just sort of fold it and twist it and put it in the pan. And that turns out fine. But I think for me, I'm like, well, I first started making it just twisting it, cutting it, and looking at it. And I kept thinking, well, that doesn't look like the babka that I was looking at in photos. That's not the one that Russ and Daughters has where it's all those thin layers. And I'm like, how can I get layers to pop out more? And I think I started putting some of the filling between the layers, because if you're just rolling it up and you've got dough on dough, then that sort of gets lost as it's proofing. And I'm like, what if I just covered some of it more with the filling and then twisted it up, and then you don't have dough on dough, you have dough, chocolate dough. And I just kept thinking more layers, the better.
It's so smart. And it does give you don't have, just what you said, you don't have dough on dough. Does the filling, because we're going to put an egg wash on this, does the filling kind of dry out? Like, is it a messy business trying to roll up something that you just
It's
spread?
not, no, usually, and if you work quickly and you've had your babka dough in the refrigerator, usually when you put the warm chocolate on it, it doesn't seize up, but it sets up. It's not this messy, oozy chocolate thing anymore.
I love that. I thought that was so brilliant. But anyway, now we're going to pick up our babka with 2 hands, place it into our prepared. I love that you say 2 hands in case someone thought, whoops, and then they drop it on the ground. And now it proofs. So we'll cover the babka with a clean kitchen towel or plastic wrap, set it in a warm place to proof for 2 to 3 hours until the loaf doubles in size. Bake it at around 350. Make an egg wash, and I love that I make an egg wash the same as you with egg and salt in a small bowl, and then brush the wash generously over the surface, which is going to give us
shine and browning.
Yeah. Place the babka loaf on the center rack. Bake for about 45 to 50 minutes until deeply golden brown. And you have us rotate halfway through the baking time. I always rotate, which I learned when I worked in a professional bakery. Do you always rotate? Like at home, do you rotate?
No.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Sometimes I don't. Sometimes, too, if I think it's too, especially professionally, if it's too heavy of a pan, where rotating is going to be almost hazardous.
Yeah.
Like, think if you have this pan of really heavy loaves and you have a baker who's lifting it up high.
Yeah.
And they have to pull it out. Then they have to find a flat surface to lay it on. And I'm talking like a full-size sheet tray, which is
filled
like 20,
with like 12 loaves on it.
Yeah,
or
and I'm like, it gets too heavy and
Yeah.
it's too hot. And I feel like it's too dangerous. I usually don't. And maybe the back is browned a little bit more than the front ones, but I feel like that's a safety call and an efficiency call, and I'm like, it's not worth it. It's not that much of a difference, but I usually do rotate as much as I can.
Yeah, I have to do it at home just because of hot spots in my oven, and it's just not worth it.
Yeah.
But it feels so liberating when I don't. I can't
know,
believe I put it
true.
in and I never took it out. Or never,
I'm not going to rotate this time.
Exactly. It feels like I'm being a radical. So we'll make the glaze while the babka bakes and then glaze it. The glaze is similar to the filling. It's milk chocolate, and it's bittersweet chocolate, double boiler, adding butter and honey till melted. Mm-hmm. So it's basically the filling except with some butter added.
Yeah. It sets up like a sort of like fudge.
Remove the babka from the oven, set aside to cool for 5 to 10 minutes until cool enough to touch. Place a clean kitchen towel on the counter. We're going to flip our babka out, place right side up, and it slides out pretty easily.
Yeah, usually I think I line my pan with the parchment paper, and just so the parchment paper is like an inch up the long sides on either side, so and then I use that to pull up the babka and put it down on the cooling rack.
And it should sound hollow.
It should definitely sound hollow.
Do we spoon the warm glaze on right away, or do we let it? That's what
usually let it. Yeah, I usually spoon it on right away.
Yeah. Spoon the warm glaze over the top of the babka while still warm.
Yeah.
Wait for glaze to set before slicing. About 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you just about a couple of other recipes from the book that I like.
Oh,
I'm just curious about. I feel you have to tell us about your salted caramel sticky buns, which you first made at Roberta's, which the New York Times loved. And at least when you wrote A Good Bake, you described it as an item that you were most known for.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Please tell us about them.
They're this umami thing happening, and I don't think I intentionally set out to make them that way. That's just sort of how they turned out. I think the first sticky bun recipe I tried at home was from the Baking with Julia cookbook that was written in the 90s. And I think it was...
With Dory, right?
With Dory Greenspan wrote the book. I think she got bakers to contribute to the book. I think it was Nancy Silverton's recipe. And I love the technique of laminating the dough with butter. I'm like, oh, it's a sticky bun and it's brioche and you're laminating the brioche. I'm like, that's brilliant.
Tell people just in case they don't know, when you say laminating the dough, what are we doing?
Taking dough, so it could be like the babka dough where you've already got butter in the dough, and that's what brioche is. And then you're chilling it down, you're rolling it out a little bit, then you're putting a piece of butter that you've rolled out on top of it, and you're folding dough over it. So you're enveloping the butter with the dough, and then you keep rolling it and folding it and rolling it and folding it. So you have multiple layers, like it's a croissant, multiple layers of yeasted dough and butter, and it lends to flakiness and deliciousness. I was just enamored with that technique with the sticky bun, and I wanted to do that at Roberta's. I started playing around with different sizes. Then I had to play around with the topping because I'm like, the topping at first came out too hard, and I'm like, this isn't good, it's too hard. And I think I finally settled on a right mix between how much dough to put into the cavity of each muffin tin, and then once they came out, what was the topping like? Was it setting up too hard or was it soft? And it set up so it wasn't too hard and it wasn't too soft.
I wanted you to just tell us about your secret ingredient in chocolate chip cookies, which is powdered sugar.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that
the
was
cornstarch. I think it helps the dough have that crackly effect.
Yeah, well, it's funny that I've even done a recipe tip video about adding a little bit of cornstarch to a chocolate chip cookie for this chewiness that I think it imparts.
Yes, I think so,
but
too.
I think that's so clever and maybe even easier for people to just use a little bit of confectioner sugar, which has the cornstarch in it anyway.
Yeah.
I thought that was really great. And then I know your brownie recipe is loosely based on like an old Alice Medrick recipe.
Yes.
But I also love that you're baking at 400 degrees, which is a little high for brownies. Can you just tell us?
That's from the Alice Medrick recipe. And I think she called it the Steve method.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that in the recipe.
Yeah.
And she had this little tiny book became my favorite. It had all sorts of brownies and bar recipes in it. And this was like the classic one. And she was describing her friend Steve, who baked it too hot one time. And I think it wasn't on purpose, and pulled them out. And then he's like, tried to cool them down fast in the bowl of ice water or the bottom of it. And I think I just started making that recipe, literally was making the recipe at home in the 90s.
Yeah.
And it just kept turning out. It was so good. And I'm like, I think I might have done away with putting it in the thing with the ice water, but I kept the baking at 400 and I kept the baking time the same.
I also wonder if you could, in a kind of half-assed-ish way, stick it in the freezer or stick it in the refrigerator
I've
when
tried
it's
different
hot.
Things. I've tried. I don't even know if I do that anymore. I think it still turns out just fine and good.
It's interesting, too, because when I think of Alice's famous brownie recipe, I think probably via Food 52, but it's her all-cocoa brownie.
Oh, okay.
Is one that I feel like people talk about and mimic. Because it's this interesting brownie.
I don't think I've made that one.
It's really good.
I got stuck on this one. I haven't veered away.
Yeah, it's really good without any melted chocolate. So I kind of love it because I like things that are really easy and
that's
fewer
easy.
Ingredients and no melting of.
Yeah,
so I think
you have to find the the unsweetened chocolate to make these brownies.
Yeah. Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Melissa. And I just want to say that you are my cherry pie.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
That's it for today's show. Thank you to King Arthur Baking Company in Kerrygold for supporting this episode. Don't forget to follow She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and tell your pals about us. You can find today's recipe and more information about my book tour at cherrybomb.com. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. Thank you to CityVox Studio in Manhattan. Our producers are Carrie Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Jenna Sadu. And our content and partnerships manager is London Crenshaw. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking.